Today we're going to be back in the book of Exodus. We have finally made it to chapter 4 after that lengthy look over the last 2 weeks at chapter 3 and really sort of trying to flesh out and reveal who the identity of the angel of the Lord was. Now, we as the here today know who the angel of the Lord is. But for Moses, and the people that would be hearing it for the first time, because remember, Moses began writing the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and was giving it to the people over the course of their desert occupancy, if you will, over that 40 years. So previous to that point, the people of God had no written scripture. So whenever we read it today, it's important to put ourselves in the mindset of the original audience as much as is possible, and think about when they hear these things, they would be hearing it for the first time. So after looking at that, we can move on to chapter 4. This is continuing the narrative here. Moses is speaking with the Lord via the burning bush, the angel of the Lord in the burning bush. And Moses has a few occupational qualms to work out. So, then Moses answered. It's a dangerous statement when speaking to the Lord. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He said, 'A staff.' And he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Put out your hand and catch it by the tail.' So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Again the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside the cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So when he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. "If they will not believe you," God said, "or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. And if they will not believe even those 2 signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile shall become blood on the dry ground." I'm going to stop there because there's a lot to work through. So, right off, we see Moses presenting an objection to the Lord's command. Now, this is why I said it's dangerous whenever we see and someone answered the Lord. Exodus 4. So we see Moses responding, and the first thing in this account is, they're not going to listen to me. Well, we could be tempted to say, well, yeah, he's been away for 40 years. But we know from our previous study, looking at the history and looking at the social and elite political structure, Moses has somewhat of a decent standing for this point, He's the former adopted crown prince of Egypt, who more or less lived the luxury life for 40 years before fleeing in the desert. The people, they might not like you. They were making mud bricks for your adopted father and mother, and you're living in the palace. So Moses' objection isn't completely unfounded. He really has no standing. We know that 40 years previous, he attempts to save someone, and then the next day goes out, and they're arguing amongst themselves, and then they complain, well, who made you a judge over us? So, he's not wrong. But just because the facts, as we know them, might seem to line up, doesn't discredit the power of the Lord. Obviously, the Lord has a plan. The very point of Moses leaving Egypt was all part of the Lord's plan. So, the Lord asked Moses, "What is that in your hand?" A staff. Now, we know shepherds use staffs. 1 is to walk with. 2, it's to beat off the wolves. They actually had to do that. 3, and we don't know when this particular feature of the curved hook that you see a lot of shepherds and paintings with came into play. But if it were one like that, the main reason is you could actually catch the sheep by the neck and pull them to you. And as someone who actually has farmed sheep now, I can tell you, I very much want a curved shepherd's hook, because grabbing the little things when they're trying to get away, it's not as easy as you might think. They're not as docile and fluffy cotton balls as they look. So, a staff. This is a very important tool. So it already to Moses is a occupational, if you will, the tool. He also relies on it. He's walking. Now, mind you, he's 80 at this point. So it's not just an occupational tool. The man is already 80, and he still has 40 more years of occupation to go through. So the Lord's giving him a staff here for a reason. But also, I think it shows us that Moses has spent 40 years in the desert tending a bunch of sheep that wanted nothing more than to run off and die. He's going to spend the next 40 years tending a bunch of people in the desert that want nothing more than to run off and die. So the Lord has been preparing him both literally. He knows the Sinai Peninsula, no doubt, by like the back of his hand. He knows where the water is. He knows where the ravines are. So he knows that. He knows where the wolves probably would be lurking. So he spent time in the region that, though he doesn't know it, the Lord knows he's going to be spending a lot more time in. He's now trained to deal with some of the most stubborn, ornery, and stupid creatures on earth. You can interpret which group I'm talking about. But at this point, it's not just a utilitarian tool. I think it's almost that image of identity. He's going to be shepherding the people as well. So this staff, is very important. So the Lord turns the staff into a serpent, and Moses jumps back. Probably a smart thing to do. There was no hospitals to go to. You're out in the desert. And given that most of the serpents in the Arabian region and the Sinai Peninsula, you really don't want to get bit by. Particularly not one that was a divinely created one. And they're telling what it could do. But it's a sign, okay? And I think it's interesting that the Lord chooses this sign as that in some ways, we're going to see it later on, where there's a plague, and the Lord has to lift up, Moses has to lift up the serpent on the pole, and those who look at the serpent will be healed. But it was a serpent that got mankind into this mess to begin with, and yet the Lord continues to use this subservient imagery, okay? And I just think there's an interesting correlation there. On top of that, despite the errors in the Disney adaptation, we do know that Moses' staff ends up taking care of the magician's attempts, which we also know from history that the Egyptian priests did have means of smoke and mirrors, and we're going to look at that. But whatever happened, the Lord's divine serpent does indeed take care of them. But also, it's interesting that this is the staff that Moses is going to strike Egypt with. Now, within the Egyptian lore and Egyptian pantheon, I cannot remember the exact deity's name because there's a bunch of them, but there's one particular, one particular goddess that is supposed to, her entire role is defending the Pharaoh. Okay, you see the vulture and you will see the cobra head on the Pharaoh's crown. So it's interesting that the house of Pharaoh is supposed to be defended by this divine serpent, okay, within their cosmology, within their imagery. The snake goddess was actually one of the more prominent ones. So the fact that Moses is declaring war on Egypt, if you will, with a snake, or a staff that becomes a snake is the first sign, there's powerful imagery there. But on top of that, obviously it's Yahweh doing it, but the Lord is not above using means of various forms. Imagine how the people in the court would have perceived this. The Egyptian nobles, they don't know who Yahweh is. They just know that this man, who 40 years ago was the crown prince, the legal firstborn, who's been away for 40 years, returns to court one day, throws his staff down, and it becomes a powerful serpent in the presence of the court, and then proceeds to swallow up the staffs of the magician snakes. So to the Egyptian mindset, this would have they would have been shaken, okay, because the serpent is the imagery of the Pharaoh. So the fact that Moses' serpent, as we will later see, is going to overpower, Pharaoh's priests, it would have been instantly casting doubt to who rightfully should be sitting on the throne. And no doubt that's what the politicians in Egypt initially thought this was. Because Moses is the legal heir, the firstborn. Tutmosis III is the lesser-born second son by a lesser wife. Out of a pharaoh of a lesser wife, out of a pharaoh of a lesser wife. So he doesn't have the best pedigree. He's literally a sideline, where Moses is the legal adopted son of Hatshepsut, who is the royal princess of the queen who or the daughter of the former queen, who was the daughter of the founder of the dynasty. So you have full pedigree on one side, questionable pedigree on the other. So just keep all that in mind, and I know it's a lot, but the Lord is very specific with his signs. He is achieving multiple birds with one tiny little stone. So, secondly, the Lord said, if they do not respect this sign, put your hand into your cloak and pull it out, and it's leprous. Now, the imagery here, I don't necessarily have the correlation necessarily, but this would have been a very drastic thing to see. We don't have the same effect with leprosy. We might need to move the ice bucket into the kitchen. We don't have the same effect with leprosy today as we have more or less handled it. But in that time, the disease or diseases that would have been comprised of leprosy effectively affected the skin, would turn it white, and it would effectively enact necrosis on the skin, and it would just sort of flake and peel off in rotten chunks. Yeah. It was often a terminal diagnosis as well, as they did not have any means of curing the bacteria infection that causes what we know as leprosy today. As I said, there probably were a few different causes. They just grouped them into one category of leprosy over there. So when Moses does this, the people they don't want to catch it, so they're going to stand back. But it's a sign that the Lord's power not only can turn a staff into a serpent, which is pretty miraculous, but in a sense, it was a sign to the court, and then for the people in particular, this is a sign of death, but the Lord's power can cure it just like that. Like to anyone else, a leper's hand is a sure diagnosis to lose the hand, maybe the arm, and probably the life. But in this case, all Moses has to do is stick his hand back in the cloak and pull it back out, and it's perfectly healed back to normal. Okay, so it is a very impressive sign. And then the Lord declares again that they may believe that the Lord, or that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. So again, we have the Lord declaring his name, and now that we've looked at the history from who the angel, because this is still the angel of the Lord speaking, we know that is Christ, the second person. It is proper for him to use the name Yahweh, as it is the divine name. So he's telling him, it was me with Abraham. It was I with Jacob. It was I with Isaac, and I would be with you. So that statement there has quite a bit of weight to it. So, and then finally, he's given a third sign. Now, initially, these three signs are specifically given, at least at first, to the people of Israel. But we see here that the Nile becoming blood isn't what's prophesied here as much as taking water from the Nile and pouring it on the ground, which was a sign to the people of Israel. Now, they still lived in Goshen, which we don't have the map up. I should have drawn it again, but I didn't. But the Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt. It's where the water, it's where the fish, it's the trading commerce, etc. So to take some of the life-giving water and pour it out on the land and it become rotten, blood, which putrefies in the desert heat very quickly, would have again been a fantastic sign to see. And we know that later on the Lord amps it up a little bit and doesn't turn the water out of the river on land into blood, but turns the entire river to blood. And we're going to look at that. But I just wanted to emphasize how the foreshadowing and going forward in the narrative here, keep an eye out, if you will, for areas where Yahweh prophesies or Yahweh gives warning to where the people of Egypt could mitigate some of the problems. Look at the graciousness in the Lord's judgment. Even in judgment, there are areas where there's foreshadowing, there's forewarning. It's not a cold turkey cut off of the, warning. No, he's still merciful even in judgment. He's always telling them what they weren't taken by surprise, they just didn't listen. And we're going to see that. So, verse 10, but Moses said to the Lord, here we go again. O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, then Yahweh said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Now therefore go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, "O my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs." So Moses raises three objections or attempts to parry the mission here. And the Lord rebuttals him with a greater and greater and greater effect. The first time he gives them signs. The second time he reminds Moses who made everything. And the third time, in direct response, or actually in preemptive response to Moses complaining, the Lord's already had Aaron on his way. Because mind you, if this is to be taken literally, then by the time the Lord is telling Moses this, Aaron's already walking. Because as we did look at, and there's some marker, I will have to draw a quick map. We'll get it later. So here's the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Red Sea. And here's Egypt proper. Well, as we know, Thebes is down here, which is the capital. We also know Moses' family, his Hebrew family, as well as the royal one, were from Thebes because of the close connection to the palace. So Aaron is likely still down here, as Aaron, we later see, has some rapport with the elders. So if you want to call it the Hebrew Council of Elders, whatever, they're essentially, Goshen's up here, but so from anywhere in this zone, Aaron still has to walk up and around and back down. It's still like a 2-week journey on foot. So the Lord has already sent Aaron on his way for him to be able to say, "Look, your brother's already coming to meet you." Now Moses hasn't seen his brother in a minimum of 40 years, according to the text. It's not likely they've been sending, ravens or parrots or whatever they use in Egypt. But even before that point, the first 40 years, Moses was in the royal court. And it wasn't until after 40 years that he even went out to see his people, according to the text. So Aaron may be his brother, but they're not likely to have had a whole lot of interaction in 80 years, give or take maybe a few passing. So the fact that the Lord is commanding this shows the divine providence here over creation, but over the hearts of individuals, because Aaron's not just going to take a field trip out in the middle of nowhere unless the Lord was leading him to do that. I mean, it's dangerous. It was dangerous when Moses had to flee, and yet the Lord protected him. So, and he tells him, "Take the staff in your hand with which you shall do the signs." Now in verse 18, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And Yahweh said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons and made them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And Yahweh said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son.'" So from the very beginning, Pharaoh knew what was on the table. The 10th plague was not something that struck unannounced at midnight. Even when it was happening, the Lord provided, merciful means out. But from the very beginning, the Lord declares to Pharaoh what the terms of this contest are. It's either my son or your son. From the very beginning, it is Yahweh, the house of Yahweh, versus Pharaoh and the house of Pharaoh. The entire narrative is set up much like you would read the account of a conquering king. And it is written from the victor's side, as history always is. But the entire account reads much like you would read the Chronicles coming back, from a war zone. So just keep that in mind, that this isn't just, trying to pull them out of slavery. This is big, grand, political imagery going on here. The Lord is going to make a name for himself, and he's going to do so by crushing Pharaoh in Pharaoh's house. So, okay. Yes. Yeah.
When Moses tells his father-in-law Jethro, I want to see if my people are still alive. Have you thought about that? Or, I really haven't, but why do you think he framed it that way?
Well, I did think about it when looking over it. It's like, on one hand, I don't think he's had any contact in 40 years. Now, he's 80. So his brother, Aaron, and his sister are both older than him at that point. This is one of the things the Disney movie and the Ten Commandments really gets off. He wasn't some strapping 30-year-old. He was 80 when all this is going on. Aaron is 83 at the beginning of this. And, so it's quite likely that he wonders if they're just dead, if the entire generation's just dead. Now, we do know that at least at this point, most men were still living longer, or at least the house of Abraham seemed to be. I think it's part of the divine blessings there on the people of God, live long in the land. It's actually part of their actual blessing. But also, just generally, we're not that many generations down from the flood. But 80 is still a good age to reach in any era post-flood.
So you're thinking about his own family, immediate family, not
potentially, but also more broadly, you can definitely apply. I mean, if he's had very little contact, because he's effectively been in exile, he doesn't even know that Pharaoh's not hunting him anymore, because the Lord has to tell him that Pharaoh whom you fled from, that person's dead. And we see that's true, because when he comes back, the Pharaoh on the throne, and I'm making the case for Tutmosis III, his half-younger stepbrother, it gets complicated there. He doesn't try to kill him all right off. He actually receives him into the court. So in that sense, the movie adaptions are, I don't know that there was a familial jovialness, but, he wasn't just executed by the guards outside the palace. So we know that the Lord's word is true. Pharaoh doesn't try to kill him. In fact, Pharaoh never tries to kill him. So what that tells me is that probably Tutmosis III was actually probably in terror of Moses the whole time, because he's the younger, somewhat illegitimate stepbrother, and Moses is the legal heir. So you got that dynamic shift from when Tutmosis II was on the throne, he's trying to stamp out Moses, who he views as a usurper, even though he's actually the legal heir. He wants his own son on the throne. So you see the Lord telling him, Pharaoh who wanted your life is dead. Don't worry about it. So he doesn't even know that. So it's likely just no communication. I don't think he's thinking they've been eliminated as a people, because Pharaoh wouldn't want to kill off all the workers. If they're oppressing the Hebrews, trying to keep them under control, but it doesn't do any good to have no people to work for you. So it's interesting, but what it really struck me as, Andy, is almost the way people do things. And I'm not saying he's spinning it, but it's almost like, I need to go back to make sure my family's still alive, as if he's almost doubting whether or not his father-in-law will give him permission. Now, mind you, he's 80. We don't know how old his father-in-law is. He's actually probably younger than him, to be in all truth. There's a decent chance he could be. But then again, it really depends. We don't know how soon after Moses came to Midian he was given a wife, etc. He could be older. He continues to show up later on, so he's at least long-lived at minimum. But it is interesting to see some of that familial interaction there within the narrative. So those are my thoughts on it. I mean, it's one of the things I think the text includes. I mean, Moses is writing it, so he could have left it out. He wrote it. But I think it's included there to show the reality of the humanity. Like, He couldn't just pack up and leave. He's been the chief foreman for his father-in-law's flocks for 40 years. He really does have to submit a notice. That sort of thing. It's showing that maybe it's even a lesson that even when the Lord calls us to do something, it doesn't mean drop all your current responsibilities willy-nilly and just go after it. There's still a due process of order and decency.
Yeah, I'm saying he isn't really showing his hand, though, that, oh, by the way, Jeff, the Lord told me to go and deliver my people.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely. That's to me. That's why it almost gave this feel of. It wasn't that he was trying to con his father-in-law, but he was intentionally putting his words in such a way to get a positive outcome. Situational development, among other things. But it is interesting that it's included because that's how I took it too. Is like it almost makes you feel like Moses is careful with what he's saying, the way it's being worded, because obviously, it's good to see those things and flesh them out because it shows us, real people within the text. So, I'm going to fine, I won't skip over the section that people sort of grimace at. Verse 24, at a lodging place, on the way, Yahweh met with him and sought to put him to death. This is Moses, mind you. And you say, well, what's going on? Well, we're about to find out. Then Zipporah, Moses' wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskins and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he, Yahweh, let him alone. And it was then, she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. Now, there's so many pieces that could be misinterpreted, and there's a lot that just tends to get skimmed over. But we see two things up front. One, Moses is a Hebrew male. Two, as such, he's a member of the covenant people of God. He now has legal and appropriate sons through a legal, lawful wife, and all of these things do matter. Those sons should have already been given the sign of the covenant. That's the first thing that jumps out. Okay, so right off the bat, Moses, even in exile, should have been doing his job as head of the household and have given those sons the sign of the covenant. Okay, he hasn't, so it's almost as if a neglect or just oversight or a lack of dedication, whatever. The Lord shows up and effectively is going to judge him for it, which is interesting because he just sent him on a mission. But, the Lord sometimes does things that, from our human perspective, don't make sense. From the divine plan, every piece is orchestrated to achieve a greater goal. We just can't see all the pieces moving. Zipporah, his wife, effectively has to step in and do the very thing that Moses should have already done in order to save Moses' life, because she then has to effectively circumcise her boys, and we don't know how old they are. So it's a fairly bloody, gruesome scene going on. That's why I was making sure there's no kids in here. Just knowing what's going on. But effectively, she then puts the blood on Moses' feet and declares a bridegroom of blood. Now, I think it's an interesting way that it's phrased, because it doesn't directly correlate. But if you look at the broader scope of things, she's effectively saying, he's my legal husband. These are my rightful legal sons. They've now been entered into the covenant. That part's been taken care of. I think it's conveying all the blood requirements are met. There's no piece missing, if that makes sense. As I said, and it doesn't just jump out of the page. It's super easy to interpret. So work with it there. But effectively, Moses was in sin by not taking care of this. His wife has to step up to do it because the Lord was quite angry with him. So preferably, if you have any questions, ask Philip later. Because it's one of them, even for me, it's like, what exactly is going on here? So, verse 27. The Lord Yahweh said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Remember, this is the Middle Eastern Egyptian greeting on the cheek here. Don't be Americanizing it. Kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of Yahweh which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered all the people of Israel, the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed, and when they had heard the Lord had visited the people of Israel and had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. Now, I guess it's a good thing my map was partially here. Remember, Goshen is up here in northern Egypt on the Mediterranean. So the people up here. So Moses and Aaron returned, because Sinai is down here. They returned to the people. It would have taken a decent bit to get back. And even once they meet with the elders, because it would have taken a while for the elders to assemble, because within the structure of the people, the Hebrews, every clan, every house, if you will, had elders that were overseeing each house. So in order to assemble them all, would have literally taken elders from here, all over the province where they're living. So there's actually a time progression it takes, because they're walking. They walk everywhere. Or ride on a donkey, most likely walking. They assemble, they then meet, and then, Aaron delivers the word from Moses, and the people believe. And they bow their heads and worship. So we see the first of the prophecies that Yahweh has made to Moses, that the people will believe, he's already told them they're going to. He's giving them the signs to prove it, and now we've already seen that first level of completion there. So, how much? 4 minutes. I really don't want to start chapter 5. So what we see there is that Moses is being faithful, as faithful within the narrative as possible here. He's doing what he's told. The narrative's progressing. Moses and Aaron are with the people. They've shown the signs. They have proclaimed. The people are believing. Now, remember, assuming they had held this meeting somewhere up here, it's going to take a little while for this information to get out, because word of mouth again. They probably weren't using the Egyptian postal system. So, and if they were, if it's anything like ours, well, better tell somebody in person. So, it's going to take a while. And then even once they leave in chapter 5, and we're not really starting it, but I'm going to point it out. Okay, if they're up here, it's still going to take a while to get down to Thebes, the capital. Now, unless possibly Pharaoh was in residence in Memphis, which at this point had been reduced to the northern capital, if you will, like the secondary city, it's possible that Pharaoh is in residence in Memphis for this. But it's likely that he was in Thebes, as he's a member of the 18th dynasty, ruling family of Egypt. Their power is based in Thebes. Their politicians, their political structure, all the centrality is in Thebes. So the likelihood is that Pharaoh was there, Moses had to go down to him. So, any questions from this week's lesson as I wrap up? Nobody? I didn't say anything questionable?
Back to Andy's question, in verse 18, I kind of get the impression he's still not really comfortable with this idea. Maybe that's why he didn't say.
No.
I think if it was something he was really excited about, felt confident about, that he'd be like, God is sending me.
No, I sort of got that feel too. I think you're right. It's not only is he not wanting to reveal too much, but it's almost like, I don't want to set myself up for failure. Like, you don't want to go announcing the big plan and then it fail. Because, if it get down there and it goes badly, I can just run away again, because he's good at that. And run back to my father-in-law. Oh, yeah, they're dead. Don't worry about them. We're good. I found out. I don't need to go back to Egypt. I mean, effectively, he's setting himself up with a back door. I mean, he's already fled Egypt once with no concern for his brothers. So, if we read it knowing the full details, it's almost a note of comic there when he uses it as a reason, I need to go check on my brothers to see if they're still alive. What about the last 40 years, Moses? But of course, his father-in-law, being the wise man that he was, yeah, you go do that. It's okay. You probably need to do that. But yeah, you definitely get that feel of it's almost a hesitancy. I don't know if you want to say ashamed, but definitely not feeling comfortable with this role yet. Still seeing how the cards fall, which, albeit is a human tendency, it's not necessarily a desirable one when the Lord's work is concerned. So, anything else? If not, Don, would you mind praying for us, closing us out?
Lord, we thank you for this lesson. We thank you, Lord, that you are showing us Christ in the Old Testament. We appreciate Justin's preparation and very insightful teaching. You have blessed him, no doubt. We pray, Lord, you will be with the pastor as he presents the message. We thank you, Lord, for all the many blessings that you provide for us, especially that you speak directly to us through your word. There'll be no question as to what you expect of us, even though sometimes we don't want to hear. Your word is clear to us. It was clear to Moses. We just thank you, Lord, that you have given us the ability to accept it for what it is. These things we pray in Christ's name.
Amen.